The Briarwood Hotel had a reputation. Not the glamorous kind, not the luxury sort. Its fame came from whispers, fragments of rumour traded on obscure forums and buried in forgotten blogs. Evelyn knew those words well. She'd seen them countless times online, buried deep in strange corners of the internet where amateur ghost hunters, conspiracy theorists, and thrill seekers swapped stories like currency. The rumour always played the same way. The Briarwood was a beautiful, ageing hotel room from another era. Guests checked in, saw their rooms numbered neatly down the hallway, except the numbers jumped. Room 5, Room 7, no Room 6. When curious guests asked about it, the hotel staff would smile too tightly, shrug too quickly, and mutter something rehearsed. Room 6 was never built, but the same threads that mentioned the missing room also hinted at something else. Stories of guests lying awake at night, swearing they'd heard faint whispers through the walls where Room 6 should have been. Some claimed to hear footsteps pacing behind the wallpaper. A few said they heard laughter, others crying. Evelyn had built her career dismantling these kinds of legends. She was a travel writer, but not the kind who recommended the best brunch spots or hidden beaches. Her niche was stranger. She turned down paranormal rumours, peeled back the curtain and exposed the reality behind them. Haunted castles usually came down to bad plumbing. Cursed roads were just clever marketing. Shadows in photographs, always dust on the lens. The Briarwood, she told herself, would be no different. Still, something about the story gnawed at her. There was a persistence to it, a kind of collective agreement among strangers who never met. Something was wrong with this hotel. The first thing she noticed was how ordinary the place looked. 5 stories of weathered brick, faded green awnings over cracked windows, a flickering neon sign missing 2 letters, and yet despite its plainness, Evelyn hesitated on the sidewalk, the winter air biting at her cheeks. It wasn't just a hotel, it was a place shaped around an absence. Somewhere inside, behind a stretch of ordinary walls, was Room 6, or where it used to be. Locals called it the missing room, and soon Evelyn was going to find out why. Inside the Briarwood Hotel, everything felt rehearsed. The lobby was small but strangely immaculate, like it had been frozen in time decades ago. Brass fixtures polished into a dull shine. A faded rug stretched across the marble floor, edges worn and frayed. At the front desk, a middle-aged man greeted Evelyn with a polite, almost mechanical smile. His uniform was crisp but outdated. When Evelyn slid her printed confirmation across the counter, he glanced at it only briefly before pulling a brass key from the drawer and placing it gently on the counter. A heavy leather tag dangled from it, embossed with the number 7. Room 7, he said softly, the words clipped and final. But Evelyn frowned. Her confirmation clearly said Room 6. She pointed it out casually, expecting an apology, maybe a quick correction, but the man froze for just a heartbeat. Then he recovered, forcing the same practiced smile back onto his face. "There is no Room 6, he said, in a tone that suggested this wasn't up for debate. When she pressed again, his smile faltered. He leaned forward, voice dropped just enough to make her lean in. "There has never been a Room 6, ma'am." Something about the way he said it didn't sound like denial. It sounded like a warning. Evelyn took the key without further argument and made her way upstairs, curiosity gnawing at her. The hallway on the second floor stretched long and narrow, lit by humming bulbs and brass sconces. The carpet was worn thin in the centre, patterned with faded reds and golds. She found Room 5 easily enough. Its door painted a soft cream, a tiny brass number nailed to the frame. Room 7 stood just a few doors down, but between them there was something strange. The place between Room 5 and Room 7 was far too wide enough for another door. Evelyn stood in the empty stretch of wall where Room 6 should have been, her hand brushing across the wallpaper. Beneath her fingertips the wall felt colder than the rest, and heavier, like something solid was sealed away behind it. Her key said Room 7, but her booking had promised Room 6, and Briarwood, she thought, was already lying to her. Night settled over the Briarwood Hotel like a heavy blanket. Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed in Room 7, her laptop open, a half-written blog draft glowing faintly on the screen. The air was still, but the old radiators hissed softly in the corner, filling the silence with a low, uneven hum. Outside, the streets had gone quiet, leaving only the creaks of an aging building settling into itself. Just past midnight she heard it. At first it sounded like nothing more than faint shifting of pipes behind the walls, a distant thud, maybe the muffled noise of a TV from a neighbouring room. But the longer she listened, the clearer it became. Voices. Evelyn muted her laptop and tilted her head towards the wall that separated Room 5 from where Room 6 should be. The voices were layered, indistinct, a dozen overlapping murmurs, tangled like threads. She pressed her ear closer, straining to pick out the words, but there weren't any. Just crying, soft laughter, a voice humming something without melody, and beneath it all, Almost buried came a deep, rhythmic knocking, steady as a heartbeat. Evelyn froze. She glanced at the clock on her bedside table. 12:41 a.m. No one should be in that space. The hotel clerk had been clear. There was no room 6. But someone, or something, was behind that wall. Summoning a flicker of courage, she raised her hand and rapped slightly against the plaster. 3 soft knocks. Silence. The whispers stopped all at once, as if the entire unseen gathering had turned to listen. Evelyn leaned back, pulse quickening, holding her breath. For a long, unbearable moment there was nothing. No laughter, no crying, not even the hum of the pipes. Then just as she started to step away, a faint laugh bled through the wall. High and breathy, close enough to feel against her skin. She jerked back, nearly tripping over the bag, and stared at the blank stretch of wallpaper. It looked perfectly ordinary, but when she reached out, her fingertips brushed against it and recoiled. It was ice cold, colder than the air, colder than the marble stairwell downstairs. Something was on the other side, something that wasn't supposed to be there. The next morning, Evelyn couldn't shake the voices she'd heard. She sat at the tiny desk in her room, sipping lukewarm coffee while replaying the sounds in her head. The laughter, the crying, that deep, steady knocking. The front desk clerk had insisted there was no room 6, yet someone, or something, had been behind that wall. Evelyn needed answers. Down in the basement, the Briarwood's archives smelt of damp wallpaper and decades of dust. A low ceiling pressed down on rows of old filing cabinets, boxes stacked like fragile towers, and drawers stuffed with crumbling hotel records dating back over a century. An elderly archivist shuffled between the stacks, her glasses perched on the very tip of her nose. She looked at Evelyn with a polite curiosity but said little. "I'm writing a feature," Evelyn explained lightly, forcing a casual tone. Looking into the hotel's history, the woman nodded, silently sliding a heavy leather ledger across the desk. The earliest blueprints were unremarkable. 5 floors, 20 rooms each. On those diagrams, room 6 existed. Perfectly ordinary, nestled between rooms 5 and 7 on every level. But when Evelyn pulled out the next set of blueprints, drawn several decades later, her breath caught. Room 6 was blacked out, not erased, not omitted, but blacked out completely. The surrounding measurements scratched away, as though someone didn't just want the room gone, they wanted the memory of it destroyed. The archivist glanced up at her in silence. Evelyn tapped the blueprint gently. "This, what happened to room 6? The woman hesitated, then leaning forward slightly, she lowered her voice. "Some rooms shouldn't be opened again." That was all she said. Evelyn pressed for more, but the archivist's face hardened, and she turned back to her work without another word. As Evelyn packed up the blueprints, she noticed something else. An incomplete ledger entry from over 50 years ago. A guest name she didn't recognise checked into room 6. There was no checkout date, no charges, no follow-up, just a line through their name. Her hands trembled slightly as she returned the ledger to the pile. Whatever had happened in room 6, the hotel had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury it. And yet, at night, the voices still spoke. The next morning, Evelyn couldn't shake the sound of the voices. She sat at the tiny writing desk in her room, her coffee cold and untouched, staring at her notebook while fragments of the night before replayed in her mind. The soft crying, the broken laughter, that slow, deliberate knocking. The front desk clerk had insisted there was no room 6, but something or someone had been behind that wall. She needed answers. The Briarwood's archives were tucked away in the basement behind a locked door. The smell hit her first. Damp paper, aged wood, and the faint bite of mildew. Rows of filing cabinets stood like soldiers in formation, drawers overflowing with fragile documents, yellowed ledgers, curling photographs, brittle maps. The first thing Evelyn noticed was how tired she felt. It wasn't the kind of tired a night's rest could fix. It was heavier, deeper, something that sat behind her ribs and clung to her thoughts. She told herself it was the travel, the long nights of writing, the strangeness of the place, but the truth settled in slowly. Something inside Briarwood was changing her. She began to lose time. One evening she woke up lying on the carpet of her room, fully dressed, her laptop still open on the bed. Her voice recorder was running in her pocket, even though she didn't remember switching it on. When she played it back, the first 5 minutes were silent, just the soft hiss of static. Then came the whispers, low, layered, tangled together so tightly she couldn't separate one voice from the next. It was impossible to tell if they were speaking in another language or if the words themselves had been swallowed before they reached her ears. Somewhere in the recording, faint and distant, she heard her own name. The dreams started soon after. Endless windowless corridors stretched in every direction, lined with identical doors. No numbers, no signs. Each handle she tried refused to turn, as though the doors weren't meant to be opened from this side. She always ended up walking toward the same place, a single narrow hallway where a lone figure stood with its back to her. She could never get close enough to see its face, but as she approached, the figure would begin asking her name, over and over, softly, urgently. When she spoke, she would sometimes find herself standing in the hallway outside room 7, one hand pressed against the stretch of wall where room 6 should have been. Her fingers always came away cold. Her reflection began to look unfamiliar. Shadows under her eyes deepened no matter how much she slept. Her skin looked paler in the bathroom mirror, her expression strangely hollow, like the Evelyn she thought she knew was slipping between moments, leaving only fragments behind. Whatever was inside room 6 wasn't just behind the wall anymore. It was in her head, and it was learning her name. By the fourth night, Evelyn could no longer sit still. The whispers had grown bolder, where before they faded when she listened. Now they swelled when she leaned close to the wall, tangled and urgent, like a chorus of voices trapped in another breath. Every night they began at the same time, 3:06 a.m, sharp, precise, as if something on the other side was waiting for her. That night she checked into room 5 under a false name. She wanted to be close to the sound, close to the space between. She sat on the bed in complete darkness, the only light coming from the red glow of the alarm clock. The air was heavy and damp, thick with the faint smell of mildew. When the clock struck 3:06, there came a sound like knuckles against hollow wood. Slow, deliberate, right where room 6 should be. Evelyn grabbed the small torch from her bag and crossed the room. The wallpaper was old, patterned with faded red florals, curling faintly at its edges. She pressed her ear against it and froze. There were no whispers this time, only breathing. Close, too close. Before she could think, her fingers dug at the wallpaper's edge, peeling it back. Long strips came away easily, revealing rotten wood panels beneath, their surface rough with deep grooves and splintered scars. At first they looked random, frantic scratches in no particular shape, but when Evelyn leaned closer, torchlight trembling in her hand, she saw letters, 2 of them carved deep into the wood as though with a blade. E.H. Her initials. They looked odd. They looked old. Older than she was. The grooves were darkened, worn smooth around the edges as though they'd been there for decades. Her chest tightened, lungs refusing air. She stared at the carving until her vision blurred, until the weight of the silence in that narrow room pressed onto her ribs. Somehow, some version of her had been here before, and she'd left a mark. The torchlight flickered, and for just a moment she thought she saw something shift in the dark grain of the wood, something deeper than panelling, something behind it. The knock came again. This time she didn't hesitate. She reached for the wall. The scratches led her deeper. Evelyn's fingertips traced the grooves carved into the old wooden panels, following them like a map. The marks became denser toward the far end of the wall, clustered around a subtle outline she hadn't noticed before, a faint rectangular seam, almost invisible beneath the layers of faded wallpaper and dust. She stepped back and shone her torch across it. A door, or something shaped like one. There was no handle, no hinges. The edges were flush with the wall, sealed so perfectly it could have been mistaken for part of the panelling. In the centre, just below eye level, sat a smooth metal plate, dulled with age, where a peephole might have been. There was only darkness. The air here was colder, heavy. It clung to her skin, damp and unmoving, as though the air on the other side wasn't meant to escape. Evelyn pressed her arm against the wood. It was warm. She jerked her hand instinctively, chest tightening, her breath shallow and uneven. She knelt, bringing her ear close to the seam, listening for the whispers she'd heard every night. Nothing. And then, softly, impossibly close, something spoke her name, not whispered, not distorted, spoken clearly, like an old memory repeating itself. Her throat tightened, and for a moment she thought she'd imagined it, but before she could pull away, the seam in the wall shuddered, dust loosening from the frame, a groan vibrating through the floor beneath her feet. Slowly, with a sound like splitting wood, the door creaked inward. Darkness spilled out from the gap, thick and absolute, swallowing that narrow beam of torchlight as though the room beyond refused to be illuminated. Her heart hammered. Every instinct screamed to her to run, to retreat back into the safety of the hallway, but her feet didn't move. The voices had drawn her this far. The carvings, the ledger, the blackout blueprints, all of it had led here, and now the door she wasn't supposed to find was inviting her in. Somewhere deep in the dark, something waited, and it already knew her name. Evelyn hesitated on the threshold. The open doorway yawned before her like a wound cut into the fabric of the hotel. The faint warm air of the Briarwood stopped at the frame. Beyond it the darkness had its own weight, cold and damp, almost alive. She raised her torch, but the beam seemed to dissolve inside the room, swallowed by a shadow too deep to pierce. Even standing in the doorway she couldn't see the far wall. She couldn't see anything at all, until she stepped forward. Her boot landed on a warped wooden floorboard. It groaned beneath her weight, the sound echoing strangely as if the room was larger than it should have been. Inside, the ceiling arched unnaturally, too high and too narrow at the same time. The angles wrong, impossible, as though the geometry had been copied from a dream brought into the waking world without permission. The wallpaper was peeling in long strips, but as she passed she realised it was moving, faintly, almost imperceptibly. It seemed to swell and contract, as though the walls were breathing in slow, patient rhythm. In the very centre of the room sat a single wooden chair, facing one bare corner. The chair's legs were uneven, its frame splintered and warm, but the seat was smooth, polished by use, as though someone had sat there for a very long time. Evelyn's chest tightened, every muscle in her body screamed to leave, but her feet carried her further in, each step slow and deliberate. The air pressed against her skin like static, humming faintly. Somewhere deep within the silence she thought she could hear a low, pulsing sound, like a heartbeat buried behind the walls. As she passed the chair she glanced down and froze. The dust on the seat was disturbed. Someone had sat there recently. A chill swept down her spine, raising every hair on her arms. She turned to leave, but before she could reach the door the sound came, a final heavy click. The door shut behind her, and when she span back, gasping, there was no door at all, only seamless wall. Room 6 had swallowed her whole. Evelyn stood frozen, breath shallow. Behind her the door slammed shut with a violent echoing finality that reverberated through the warped floorboards. The sound rattled in her chest, sharp and unexpected, as though someone or something had forced it closed. She spun around, fumbling for the handle, but her fingers met only smooth wood, and then she saw it. The door was gone. Where it had been seconds ago, there was now only unbroken wall, seamless and pale, beneath the dim beam of her torch, as if there was never been any entrance at all. Her breath hitched, shallow and uneven, her pulse pounding in her ears. The room felt different now. It was changing. The corners seemed to fold inwards, dissolving into endless curves that bent in ways her eyes couldn't follow. The walls were alive, breathing with a faint rhythm, slow, deliberate, and synchronized with her own. Her light skimmed over the peeling wallpaper. The wallpaper was peeling, catching faint impressions beneath the surface. For just a moment she thought she saw faces pressing outward from behind the walls before sinking back into the darkness. Her legs weakened. She staggered towards the centre of the room, one hand brushing against the wooden chair for balance, and that was when she heard it, her own voice, faint, distant, perfectly hers. It came from somewhere deep within the walls, woven into the whispers she'd heard for nights, and yet distinct, isolated, almost rehearsed. "Why did you come here?" Her throat tightened. The voice recorder in her pocket clicked faintly, turning on by itself. Her breathing played back to her, half a second late, layered over the sounds she hadn't yet made, and then softly the voice came again. "Help me." Once, twice. Each repetition was calm, too calm. Evelyn's torchlight shook in her trembling hands. The wallpaper rippled slightly, like something was pressing closer to the other side, listening. She backed away, heart hammering, but the space around her stretched unnaturally, receding, unfolding like the room was rearranging itself. And then from deep within the walls came her own laugh, soft, gentle, endless. It didn't stop. 2 weeks passed before anyone heard anything from Evelyn again. Her readers assumed she was off-grid, buried in her next investigation, the way she sometimes vanished when researching new stories. But those who followed her blog closely noticed something strange. It updated. The new post appeared without fanfare late one night, timestamped 3:06 a.m, the exact time Evelyn had always heard the knocking. The title read, "The Room Between Rooms." At first glance it seemed like Evelyn's work. Same header image, same writing style. But the more you read, the clearer it became that something was wrong. The sentences were too precise, stripped of her usual warmth. Her wit was gone, replaced by a detached, clinical tone, as if the words were assembled by someone who understood the language, but not the meaning. The post spoke at length about spaces that shouldn't exist. It described rooms built to contain things that weren't supposed to be touched. It described doors that opened inwards, not into places, but into versions of yourself that you were not meant to meet. Readers scrolled faster, unsettled until they reached the final paragraph. Some doors lead inward, some lead further in. Room 6 is the kind that remembers the shape of who you were and learns to wear it. The post ended there. No sign-off. No comments allowed. That was the last anyone ever heard from Evelyn directly. Her email addresses bounced back undeliverable. Her publisher couldn't reach her. Hotel staff at the Briarwood claimed she'd checked out days earlier, leaving no forwarding details. But guests who stayed in room 7 after her disappearance started reporting something unsettling. Steadied rhythmic keystrokes long past midnight. Sometimes they swore they could hear a voice reading softly, matching the exact cadence of Evelyn's blog's narration. One guest swore they saw someone sitting at the writing desk in room 7's reflection in the hallway mirror, but when they opened the door, the room was empty. And on Evelyn's blog the updates keep coming, always at 3:06 a.m, always written in her voice. Whatever came out of room 6 is not Evelyn anymore, and whatever's writing wants to be found.